The millionaire's autistic son had a meltdown in the restaurant until a waitress did the unthinkable. The entire place went silent, stares turned into judgment, and the father sank into shame. But in the middle of the chaos, a waitress ignored appearances and did what no one else dared to do. With a simple, silent gesture, she turned humiliation into compassion, revealing how deeply society still fails those who are different. The Parkside Table was the most prestigious restaurant on the Upper West Side of New York City. On Saturday night, the space glowed with its soft lighting, designed to highlight the details of the contemporary decor that blended elements of the Hudson Valley with signature designer pieces. Elegant conversations mixed with the carefully selected ambient music, while the aroma of new American fusion dishes hung in the air. Roger Caldwell watched his son with apprehension. Matthew, 7 years old, fidgeted incessantly with the linen napkin, folding and unfolding it repeatedly with the precision of a small origami artist. Sweat trickled down Roger's temple as he checked his watch for the 5th time in the last 10 minutes. "Easy, son. Aunt Rachel should be here any minute," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. Rachel, his sister, had suggested this dinner to celebrate Roger's promotion to legal director at the firm where he worked. It was an achievement he had been pursuing for years, ever since he became a single father after his wife left, unable to cope with the challenges of Matthew's diagnosis. The boy gently rocked his body back and forth, his eyes a deep brown like his father's, watched with fascination as the crystals of the chandelier reflected small rainbows on the nearby wall. For now, everything was under control. In another part of the dining room, Deborah Evans was discreetly arranging the silverware on a newly set table. At 32, she had only been working at the Parkside Table for 3 months, but her efficiency and attention to detail had already been noticed by the owner, Maurice Gordon, a renowned chef who had turned the place into a culinary landmark in the city. "Deborah, table 17, please," requested Paul, the maitre d', pointing to where Roger and Matthew were waiting. As she approached, Deborah noticed something familiar in the boy's posture. The repetitive movements, the gaze focused on specific details, the way he kept his hands constantly busy with the napkin. Before working at the restaurant, Deborah had been an assistant educator at an inclusive school for 5 years, specializing in neurodivergent children. She recognized those signs. "Good evening. Welcome to the Parkside Table. May I bring you something to drink while you wait?" she asked in a calm, measured tone. "A grape juice for him, no ice, and a bourbon for me, please," Roger replied, still checking messages on his phone. "My sister is running late." Deborah noticed that Matthew had stopped his movements and was watching her intently. She gave him a gentle, understated smile and saw that he continued to fold the napkin, now with slower movements. "I like your origami," Deborah commented, addressing Matthew directly but without forcing eye contact. "Would you like me to bring more napkins so you can continue your art?" Matthew didn't answer verbally, but a small smile appeared at the corner of his lips. Roger looked at the waitress in surprise. Usually people addressed him, completely ignoring his son, or worse, giving him strange looks. As Deborah walked away to get the drinks, the dining room began to get busier. A noisy group arrived, taking the table next to them. They were executives celebrating some successful deal with loud laughter and back-patting. Immediately, Matthew tensed up. His fingers gripped the napkin tightly, and his breathing became faster. Roger recognized the signs. Sensory overload was beginning. He leaned in, speaking softly. "Matthew, how about we count to 10 together? 1, 2... But it was too late. One of the executives knocked over a wine glass, which shattered on the floor. The sharp sound of the breaking crystal was like a needle piercing Matthew's senses. His scream cut through the sophisticated atmosphere like a sharp blade. It wasn't a cry of a tantrum or a fit. It was a sound of deep pain, of someone being attacked from all sides by stimuli their brain couldn't process. The entire dining room froze. Conversations stopped. Silverware hung suspended in the air. All eyes turned to the table where Matthew was now rocking vigorously, covering his ears and making repetitive sounds, trying to block out the outside world. Roger felt the weight of dozens of stares. He clearly heard a woman whisper, "Some people don't know how to raise children," and an older man grumble something about kids in fine dining restaurants. Sweat now flowed freely down his face as he tried to calm his son, feeling himself sinking into an abyss of shame and helplessness. Paul, the maitre d', approached with a tense expression. "Sir, perhaps it would be best—" Before he could finish the sentence suggesting they leave, Deborah appeared with a tray. On it, besides the requested drinks, were a small object that looked like a fidget spinner, a cold compress, and a pair of headphones. "Excuse me," she said firmly to the maitre d', placing herself between him and the table. Then, without asking for permission, she knelt near Matthew, keeping a respectful distance. "Hi, Matthew. It's very loud in here, isn't it? I brought something that might help," she said in a low, melodic voice, placing the items on the table without touching him or invading his space. "These headphones can turn down the noise, and this cloth is nice and cool to hold." Roger watched, astonished. The waitress knew his son's name even though he couldn't remember mentioning it. And even more surprisingly, she seemed to know exactly what to do. Matthew, between sobs, peeked through his fingers, his eyes, welling with tears, fixed on the colorful spinner that was gently spinning on the table. Slowly, his breathing began to regulate. Hesitantly, he picked up the spinner and made it spin, watching the hypnotic movement. "We have a quieter table in a more private corner, if you'd prefer," Deborah continued, now addressing Roger. "It's near the window with a view of the illuminated garden. There's less noise and the light is softer." Roger felt a lump in his throat. It had been years since he had experienced such a genuine gesture of understanding regarding his son's condition. Usually, reactions ranged from poorly disguised pity to overt irritation. "Thank you," he managed to say, as Matthew was already trying on the headphones, his expression gradually relaxing. Across the room, Maurice watched the scene with a frown. The chef owner was known for his obsession with perfection and the controlled environment of his restaurant. Any disturbance was seen as a threat to the refined experience he promised his customers. As Deborah guided the father and son to the more secluded table, the gazes of the other patrons followed them. Some with curiosity, others with relief at seeing the problem being removed from their vicinity, and a few with genuine empathy. Rachel finally arrived, looking confused at the sight of her brother and nephew moving to another table. Roger saw her expression and felt a pang of guilt. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, not another embarrassing episode caused by Matthew's special needs. What Roger didn't know was that this night would mark the beginning of an unexpected journey, not just for him and Matthew, but also for Deborah and for the Parkside table itself. A journey that began with a simple gesture of understanding, but would unfold into profound transformations in the lives of everyone involved. As they settled at the new table, Deborah exchanged a look with Roger, a look of someone who understands without judging. For a brief moment he felt something he had forgotten, the feeling of not being alone. The table in the quieter corner of the restaurant was like a small island of peace. The soft lighting and the view of the garden with its illuminated hydrangeas and birch trees created an almost magical atmosphere. Matthew, still wearing the headphones, watched the lights among the plants with fascination while spinning the spinner between his fingers. His breathing had returned to normal, and his body no longer showed the previous tension. Rachel, a 42-year-old marketing executive, observed her nephew with a mixture of relief and curiosity. "How did you know how to handle him?" she asked Deborah, who was discreetly arranging the table. "I worked for 5 years at the Sunflower Institute, a school for neurodivergent children," Deborah replied. "I learned that what looks like a tantrum or bad behavior is usually a way of communicating sensory discomfort." Roger felt a tightness in his chest. The Sunflower Institute was the same one Matthew currently attended. How many times had he received similar guidance from the team of therapists, yet still felt lost in public situations like this one? "Matthew goes to the Sunflower Institute," he said, meeting Deborah's eyes. "He started 8 months ago." Deborah smiled with genuine surprise. "What a coincidence. I left there almost a year ago when I decided to change careers. I love children, but I needed a change of scenery," she explained, arranging the meticulously aligned silverware. "Is Renata, the occupational therapist, still there? She's amazing with sensory integration techniques." Yes, she's the one who has helped Matthew the most with his tactile issues, Roger confirmed, feeling a strange sense of familiarity, as if meeting an old friend. You left to work in a restaurant? Actually, I'm studying culinary arts. I work here to pay for college and get hands-on experience, Deborah explained. But it seems some skills from the Sunflower Institute are still useful. At that moment, Maurice, the chef and owner, approached the table. His stern face didn't hide his discomfort with the earlier situation. Is everything all right over here? He asked, addressing Roger directly but with his eyes assessing Matthew. Yes, much better. I appreciate your understanding, Roger replied, tensing up again. Deborah sensed the shift in the atmosphere and intervened naturally. Chef, Mr. Caldwell was telling me he's the legal director at Nexus Investments. They're celebrating his promotion tonight. Maurice's eyes widened slightly. Nexus was one of the largest investment firms in the country, and having a legal director as a client was prestigious, even for the Parkside table. My congratulations, Mr. Caldwell, he said, with a now more genuine smile. It's an honor to have you for this celebration. Please, the tasting menu will be on the house. Roger tried to politely decline, but Maurice insisted. Before walking away, the chef shot a meaningful look at Deborah, a mix of approval and warning. She got the message. Resolve the situation, but don't create any more problems. When they were alone again, Rachel sighed. You always have this effect on people, Roger. They just need to know who you are, and the red carpet rolls out. Roger shook his head, uncomfortable. I'd rather be treated well for who I am, not for the position I hold. Like how Matthew is treated, Rachel asked, looking at her nephew who was now drawing geometric patterns on his napkin. With no status to protect him? A heavy silence fell over the table. Deborah, who was moving away to get the menus, stopped when she heard that direct question. Roger looked at his son, then at his sister, and something inside him seemed to break. It's exhausting, Rachel, he confessed in a low voice. Every outing is a minefield. Every disapproving look, every whisper, every unsolicited piece of advice on how to better discipline my son. People see. One moment, I live every day trying to build bridges to his world, while the world refuses to build even a single footbridge in our direction. Rachel reached her hand across the table, touching her brother's. You're not alone, Rog. You never have been. Matthew, as if sensing his father's emotion, looked up from his drawing and watched him intently. Then, to everyone's surprise, he held out his favorite spinner to Roger. Daddy's sad, he said in his voice, rarely used in public. Spinner helps. Roger's eyes welled up. That simple gesture of empathy from his son, so rare and precious, was worth more than all the promotions in the world. Deborah returned with the menus and a small surprise for Matthew, homemade modeling clay with a gentle vanilla scent. She explained that the restaurant's pastry chef made it for her own children. It has a pleasant texture and helps keep hands busy, she explained, placing the colorful container near the boy. Matthew examined the new item cautiously, running his fingers over the soft surface. After a few seconds, he began to model shapes that were precise and complex for his age. He loves textures, Roger commented, watching his son. Some days he only eats crunchy foods. Other days he'll only accept purees. Selective eating, Deborah agreed. May I suggest some adaptations to the menu for him? We have options that can be modified for different textures without altering the flavor. The dinner proceeded with a tranquility that Roger hadn't experienced in public settings for a very long time. Deborah returned periodically, not just to serve, but to check on Matthew's comfort, bringing small adjustments. A straw for his juice, vegetables cut into specific shapes, a less aromatic dish. From the kitchen, Maurice watched the interaction with growing interest. Initially, concerned about the impact on other customers, he now noticed how Deborah had turned a potentially disastrous situation into a positive experience, and more importantly, he realized that other customers were also watching, no longer with disapproval, but with respectful curiosity. Toward the end of the dinner, while Matthew was enjoying a specially prepared dessert with varied textures, a family at the next table called Deborah over. "Forgive me," the mother said in a low voice, "but I noticed how you attended to that little boy. My daughter is also sensitive to noises and textures. I can never bring her to restaurants. Do you think, would a similar accommodation be possible for her? Deborah hesitated, glancing instinctively at Morris, who was talking to other customers near the bar. She explained that the accommodations were improvised, not a restaurant policy. But if you call in advance, I can try to prepare something, she suggested, sharing her personal number. At the end of the night, when Roger asked for the check, he found only a note from Maurice reaffirming that the dinner had been complimentary, with wishes for their swift return. I'd like to thank you personally, Roger said to Deborah, as Rachel helped Matthew put on his coat. You made this night possible. I can't remember the last time we were able to have dinner out without an embarrassing episode. Deborah smiled, but there was a shadow of concern in her eyes. It was a pleasure to help, but I must confess I improvised a lot. The restaurant doesn't have protocols for situations like this. Maybe it should, Roger replied, handing her his card. If you need anything, especially if there's resistance from management because of what happened tonight, please call me. When the family left, Deborah stood still, looking at the card with the Nexus logo. In the kitchen, the chefs were already discussing the episode, some impressed by Deborah's skill, others worried about the precedent being set. Maurice called Deborah for a private conversation in his office. His face was an indecipherable mask as he closed the door behind them. What exactly happened out there tonight? He asked, crossing his arms. Deborah took a deep breath, gathering her courage. This job was her main source of income for her studies, but there were principles she wouldn't compromise. Inclusion happened, chef, and if I may be so bold, I believe it was good for everyone involved. What Deborah didn't imagine was that this conversation would be just the beginning of a much larger transformation, not only for the Parkside table, but for herself and for dozens of families who, like Rogers, desperately needed spaces that would welcome them without judgment. Maurice stared at her for long seconds, as if evaluating not just her words, but her potential. Then, to Deborah's surprise, a slow smile appeared on his usually stern face. Interesting, he murmured. Very interesting. 3 weeks had passed since the night Matthew and Roger visited the Parkside table. For Deborah, that experience had rekindled something she thought was dormant, her calling to build bridges of access where only walls of misunderstanding had existed. That Saturday morning, Deborah arrived at the restaurant early. The team meeting called by Maurice would start in half an hour, and she wanted to review her notes. Since the incident, as some staff members called it, she had been discreetly researching inclusive restaurants in other parts of the world, gathering examples of simple adaptations that could be implemented without compromising the establishment's sophistication. Paul, the maitre d', was the first to arrive after her. His face carried the typical weariness of someone who had worked late the night before. "Morning, Deborah," he greeted, pouring himself some coffee. "Ready for the battle?" "Battle?" she asked, raising her eyebrows. Paul gave a tired smile. "Luciana is furious. She said you opened a door that will be impossible to close." Luciana Miller was the restaurant's administrative manager, known for her obsession with protocols and her traditional view of what constituted a high-end dining experience. To her, children were already a problematic concession. Children with special needs represented a risk to the establishment's reputation. Gradually, the meeting room filled up. The section chefs, the sommelier, the most experienced waiters. Deborah noticed that in addition to the usual team, there were 2 unfamiliar faces. A woman of about 50 with short grey hair and red-framed glasses, and a young man who couldn't stop checking his phone. Maurice entered last, followed by Luciana. The chef clapped his hands twice, calling for everyone's attention. "Good morning, team. Before we begin, I want to introduce 2 people who will be joining us today. This is Helena Dawson, a consultant in accessibility and inclusion. And this is Charles Fisher, representing the law firm that serves the restaurant." Luciana couldn't hide a smile of satisfaction at the sight of the lawyer, as if his presence validated her concerns. Deborah, on the other hand, felt her heart race at the word accessibility. "As you all know, 3 weeks ago we had a special event," Maurice continued, choosing his words carefully. A customer with specific sensory needs was attended to in an adaptive manner by our team, more specifically, by Deborah. All eyes turned to her, and she felt her face grow warm. Since then, we have received 7 reservation requests mentioning similar needs. 3 of them have already been accommodated, with improvisations made by Deborah herself. And to my surprise, we received an email from the American Association for Inclusive Gastronomy congratulating us on an initiative that, frankly, we didn't even know we had started. A murmur went through the room. Some employees exchanged surprised glances, others looked worried. "That's why we're here," Morris concluded, "to decide whether these accommodations were an isolated case or if we should consider a permanent policy of inclusion." Luciana immediately took the floor. "With all due respect, Maurice, we need to consider the risks. The Parkside Table has built its reputation on a controlled, refined experience. Accommodations could compromise the quality our regular customers expect. Not to mention the additional costs," added Frederick, the pastry chef. "Special ingredients, staff training, extra prep time." "May I speak?" Deborah raised her hand, surprising herself with her sudden courage. Maurice nodded, curious. "I've been researching this topic. The adaptations we made were minimal, adjusting lighting and sound in one section of the restaurant, offering different texture options for existing dishes, small sensory objects like modeling clay and spinners that cost very little. The impact on cost would be minimal, especially compared to the benefit." "Benefit for whom?" Luciana questioned, crossing her arms. "For a tiny group that rarely frequents gourmet restaurants?" Helena, the accessibility consultant, cleared her throat gently. "If I may, I'd like to share some data. In the United States, it's estimated that over 5 million people are on the autism spectrum. Adding other conditions involving sensory hypersensitivity, we're looking at a significant portion of the population. It's not such a small group, and many have the purchasing power to frequent establishments like this, but they don't due to a lack of welcoming environments." Charles, the lawyer, finally looked up from his phone. "There's also the legal aspect. The Americans with Disabilities Act is clear about the obligation for commercial establishments to offer universal accessibility. While the law is more often associated with physical barriers, recent jurisprudence has been expanding the concept to include sensory and communication barriers." "Are you saying we're required to do this?" asked Paul, clearly uneasy. "Not exactly," Charles replied, "but it would be prudent, especially considering the client in question is the legal director of one of the country's largest investment firms." Deborah felt a pang of discomfort. She didn't want inclusion to be motivated by fear of a lawsuit or the client's status. "It's not about obligation but opportunity," she intervened. "Mr. Caldwell was so impressed that he's already returned twice since then, and he's brought other parents in the same situation." Maurice, who had been silently observing the debate, sat up straighter in his chair. "I received a call from Caldwell yesterday," he revealed. "He's organizing a corporate event for 80 people and wants to hold it here, on the condition that we can accommodate some guests with needs similar to his son's." A stunned silence filled the room. An event for 80 people represented a considerable income, even for a restaurant of the Parkside Table's caliber. Furthermore, Maurice continued, he mentioned the possibility of a feature in Cuisine and Art magazine about our pioneering work in sensory inclusion in high gastronomy. Apparently, the reporter is the mother of a child with auditory hypersensitivity. Luciana uncrossed her arms, visibly swayed by the prospect of free publicity in such a prestigious magazine. Helena took the opportunity to distribute some printed sheets. "I've prepared a preliminary guide with simple suggestions that could be implemented in phases, starting with low-cost, high-impact adaptations." As everyone examined the material, Deborah recognized several of the suggestions she herself had researched. Helena had organized the ideas into categories: sensory environment, lighting, sound, aromas, food adaptations, textures, temperatures, presentation, communication, visual menus, advance warnings about busy environments, and staff training. "This seems surprisingly feasible," commented Amanda, the hot kitchen chef, who had been silent until then. "Many of these adaptations are simple extensions of what we already do for customers with dietary restrictions or specific preferences." Yes, but what about the experience of other customers? Insisted Frederick. If we start to dilute our concept to accommodate all sorts of needs, we'll lose our identity. It was then that Paul, to everyone's surprise, especially Deborah's, spoke in favor of the idea. Actually, I personally witnessed how Deborah handled the 3 families who came after the incident with young Matthew. It was discreet, elegant, and didn't interfere with the experience of the other guests. In fact, there was a couple at the next table who were so impressed they asked to meet the chef. Maurice smiled discreetly, as if he already knew this detail. Look, I know change brings resistance, Deborah said, gaining confidence, but I'm not proposing we turn the parkside into a noisy children's play area. Quite the opposite. I'm talking about creating small spaces of possibility, subtle adjustments that make all the difference for those who need them, without compromising the sophisticated experience we offer. Helena nodded in agreement. The concept is known as universal design, creating environments that work well for everyone, including those with specific needs. Often the adaptations benefit even those without declared needs. Who doesn't appreciate cozier lighting or the option of a quieter space in a restaurant? The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with heated debates on every aspect of the possible adaptations. In the end, Maurice, who had listened more than he had spoken, stood up with a determined expression. We're going to run a trial, he announced. We will implement the Phase 1 suggestions from Helena's plan with Deborah's support for 3 months. We'll evaluate the financial impact and the effect on the overall customer experience. If it's positive, we'll move on to the next phases. Luciana tried to argue about the initial costs, but Maurice raised his hand, cutting her off. Consider it an investment in innovation, and if it doesn't work, at least we'll have tried to make a difference. When the meeting ended, several employees approached Deborah, some curious, others apprehensive, but all wanting to better understand how they could contribute. Helena handed her a card, inviting her for coffee the following week to discuss the details of the staff training. As she gathered her notes, Deborah felt a presence beside her. It was Maurice. You've started something interesting here, Evans, he said, using her last name as he did when he was impressed. But it will be a path with obstacles. It's worth it, Chef, she replied with conviction. Believe me, it makes all the difference when someone simply says, You are welcome here just as you are. Maurice studied her for a moment as if trying to decipher a mysterious ingredient in a dish. This seems personal for you, he observed. Deborah hesitated, considering whether she should share. She decided she would. My brother has ADHD and Tourette's syndrome. I grew up watching how difficult it was for my family to do simple things, like go out for dinner. A small adjustment, a little understanding, would have made all the difference. Maurice nodded, a new respect in his eyes. We have 3 weeks until the Caldwell event. I want you to lead this project, Evans. Show me this can work. As Maurice walked away, Deborah felt the weight of responsibility and the thrill of possibility. There was a lot of work ahead, many resistances to overcome, but for the first time in years, she felt she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Outside the restaurant, the midday sun illuminated the distant Empire State Building, its spire reaching toward the sky as if blessing new beginnings and unexpected possibilities. 2 weeks after the meeting, the Parkside table was beginning to transform, albeit subtly. To the unsuspecting customer, nothing seemed different. The elegance remained, the culinary excellence was impeccable, and the service was still refined. But to Deborah's trained eyes, the small changes were monumental. The dining room was now divided into discreetly marked areas with minimalist symbols, an area with softer lighting away from the kitchen, another with better acoustic insulation, and a third with a view of the garden, where foot traffic was lighter. The menu included small icons indicating the sensory characteristics of each dish: textures, flavor intensity, temperature. That evening, Deborah was supervising the dinner service with special attention. Roger Caldwell had made a reservation for himself, Matthew, and 2 other guests, Dr. Andrew Porter, a renowned pediatric neurologist, and his wife, Beatrice, an occupational therapist. The couple was a leading authority on serving neurodivergent children in New York, and Roger had mentioned they were interested in seeing the restaurant's adaptations. Nervous? Asked Paul, adjusting his tie as he watched Deborah rearrange the reserved table for the third time. "A little," she admitted. "Dr. Porter is an expert in the field. If he approves of what we're doing, it will be a seal of quality," completed Paul, who had surprisingly become one of the initiative's biggest supporters. "But you're forgetting he's coming as Caldwell's guest, not as an inspector." Deborah smiled, grateful for the reminder. In recent weeks, Paul had proven to be an unexpected ally. After witnessing the positive transformation of an elderly customer when they offered noise-cancelling headphones to help him better participate in conversation, the maitre d' had become an enthusiast of sensory accessibility. At 7:30 p.m. sharp, Roger arrived with Matthew and the Porters. Deborah watched with satisfaction as the boy appeared visibly more relaxed than on his first visit. He was holding a Barty small book about dinosaurs, his special interest of the moment, as Roger had informed her when making the reservation. "Good evening," Deborah greeted, approaching calmly. "Welcome back to the Parkside table." "Hello, Deborah," Roger replied with a warm smile. "I'd like to introduce Dr. Andrew Porter and his wife Beatrice. They coordinate the multidisciplinary team that works with Matthew." After the introductions, Deborah led the group to the carefully prepared table. She had arranged a special little detail, a dinosaur origami made from the napkin inspired by Matthew's interest. The boy's eyes lit up when he saw the figure, and he immediately began to examine it with careful fingers. "Pterodactyl," he said with admiration. "Perfect wings." Dr. Porter observed the interaction with professional interest. "It's impressive how you integrated his special interest into the experience," he commented. "This attention to detail makes all the difference for children on the spectrum." Deborah handed out the menus, including a version specially adapted for Matthew, with photos of the dishes and simple descriptions of the textures and flavors. "We developed this format last week," she explained. "It's in the testing phase, but we've already noticed it facilitates communication not only for neurodivergent children, but also for foreign tourists and people with reading difficulties." Beatrice leafed through the sensory menu, visibly impressed. "This is exactly what we preach about universal design," she said, exchanging a meaningful look with her husband. "Adaptations that benefit diverse profiles, not just those with declared specific needs." As she explained the menu options, Deborah noticed that 2 more families with children had entered the restaurant. One had a girl of about 10, wearing colorful headphones, a common indicator of auditory sensitivity. The other brought a teenage boy who moved a bit stiffly, a characteristic common in some neurodivergent conditions. "It seems we're not the only ones to discover this place," Roger commented, following Deborah's gaze. "How has the reception been to the changes?" "Growing," she replied, feeling a pang of pride. "In the last 2 weeks, we've received 14 reservations mentioning specific sensory needs. But what's most interesting is that regular customers, without declared needs, are requesting the quieter areas and appreciating the new sensory cues on the menu." Dr. Porter nodded, satisfied. "It's what we always say, accessibility benefits everyone. A ramp isn't just for wheelchair users, but for those pushing strollers, the elderly, or someone with a temporary mobility issue." The dinner proceeded smoothly. Matthew, comfortable in an environment now adapted to his needs, was able to explore new flavors and textures, always with the discreet support of Deborah, who had trained the staff to serve dishes with clear and predictable explanations, avoiding unexpected sensory stimuli. At one point, when Matthew needed a sensory break, Deborah led him and Beatrice to a small adapted space near the restrooms, what the team had internally started calling the sensory corner, equipped with dimmable lighting, a few pillows with different textures, and an interactive board with soft lights. "You've thought of everything," Beatrice commented, watching as Matthew calmed down while manipulating the different textures. "How long did it take to implement these changes?" 2 intense weeks, Deborah replied, but the team embraced the idea with more enthusiasm than I expected, especially after we started receiving positive feedback. "And was there any resistance?" Beatrice asked, always practical. Deborah hesitated before answering. "Some are still afraid that we're diluting the high-end dining experience, but we're proving that elegance and inclusion are not mutually exclusive. When they returned to the table, they found Roger and Dr. Porter in an animated conversation with Maurice, who had come out of the kitchen to personally greet the guests. "And we're considering expanding the concept to our new establishment in Midtown," the chef was saying with an enthusiasm Deborah had rarely witnessed. A space designed from the ground up to be sensorially inclusive without sacrificing the sophisticated dining experience. Dr. Porter seemed genuinely impressed. That would be a first in the country. There are very few similar initiatives even internationally, and they are usually spaces specifically for neurodivergent audiences, not gourmet restaurants that adapt to welcome them. "The idea came after our experience here," Maurice explained, casting a look of acknowledgement at Deborah. "We realize there's an untapped market, families with high purchasing power who rarely frequent fine dining restaurants due to a lack of proper accommodation." Roger agreed emphatically. "You can't imagine how many parents reached out to me after I mentioned this place in support networks. People who can afford the experience but haven't set foot in a restaurant like this for years for fear of judgment or lack of understanding." As the conversation continued, Deborah discreetly observed the dining room. The Parkside table was full, as usual for a Friday, but there was something different about the atmosphere. The diversity of the clientele was more evident. Besides the traditional crowd of executives and couples, there were families, elderly people, and those with visible or invisible needs, all equally enjoying the space. The restaurant felt more alive, more human. Luciana, who was supervising the dining room, approached Deborah. "I have to admit," she said in a low voice, with an expression that mixed surprise and reluctant admiration, "you proved me wrong. This month's numbers have exceeded all projections." Before Deborah could reply, Matthew, who had been absorbed in his dinosaur drawings, looked up and pointed to the restaurant entrance. "Julia!" he exclaimed with rare joy, recognizing a classmate who had just arrived with her parents. The girl, a child with curly hair and bright eyes, smiled when she saw him and waved. Her parents, visibly surprised and relieved to find a familiar face, visibly relaxed. "Can we invite them to our table?" Matthew asked Roger, showing a social initiative uncommon for him. Roger looked at Deborah, unsure of the possibility. "I don't know if there's enough room." "I can arrange an adjacent table," Deborah offered promptly. "That way the children can interact, but each family maintains their own space." The improvised solution worked perfectly. Soon the two families were chatting animatedly, while Matthew and Julia shared their passions for dinosaurs and astronomy, respectively. Dr. Porter watched the interaction with professional interest, commenting discreetly to Beatrice about the naturalness of socialization in a suitable environment. Later, when the desserts were served, Maurice reappeared accompanied by an elegant woman whom Deborah recognized as Renee Michaels, the editor-in-chief of Cuisine and Art magazine, mentioned in the meeting weeks before. "This is the mind behind the adaptations," Maurice introduced, gesturing respectfully toward Deborah. "She started as a waitress a few months ago, and now she's our sensory accessibility consultant, in addition to being a culinary student." Renee extended her hand with a warm smile. "What you've built here is impressive. As the mother of a girl with auditory hypersensitivity, I can tell you I haven't felt this comfortable in a restaurant of this caliber in years." "It was a team effort," Deborah replied, feeling her face flush. "And we're still learning and adjusting." "That's exactly what I want to write about," Renee said. "Not just the adaptations themselves, but the mindset that allows for transformation, the willingness to learn, adjust, and evolve." When everyone finally said their goodbyes, it was past midnight. The restaurant was nearly empty, except for a few staff members setting up for the next day. Deborah, exhausted but deeply satisfied, was gathering her notes when she felt a small hand touch her arm. It was Matthew, who had returned from the restroom before leaving. In his hands was the pterodactyl origami, carefully preserved. "Thank you," he said, looking her directly in the eyes, a gesture Deborah knew was significant for children like him. "This is a safe place." Those simple words, "a safe place," hit Deborah with the force of a revelation. That was exactly what they were building, not just an accessible restaurant, but a sanctuary of possibilities, where diverse people could exist without masks, without the exhaustive effort to fit in, without the constant weight of judgment. Roger, watching the scene from the entrance, approached with teary eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he said in a choked voice. "You're not just changing a restaurant, you're changing lives." As she watched the father and son walk out hand in hand into the New York night, Deborah understood that her own life had also been transformed. What had started as a temporary job to pay for college had become a mission, a purpose that united her two passions: gastronomy and creating spaces of belonging. Outside, the starry New York sky seemed to silently celebrate these small revolutions that, invisible to many, were reconfiguring the world for those who needed acceptance the most. And in Deborah's heart, a certainty was forming. This was only the beginning. The corporate event for Nexus Investments was scheduled for 3 days from now, and the Parkside table was buzzing with activity. There would be 85 people, more than the 80 initially planned, including high-level executives, international, investors, and 5 families with neurodivergent children and teenagers, at Roger's special request. Deborah was reviewing the floor plan for the 10th time, reconfiguring the tables to ensure the sensory zones were properly distributed. The restaurant would be closed exclusively for the event, which offered more freedom for adaptations, but also increased the pressure for perfect results. "I think we should move this table further from the service area," she suggested, pointing to the diagram. The noise of plates being cleared could be disruptive. Helena, the accessibility consultant, who now worked regularly with the restaurant, agreed. "And we can prepare some extra sensory kits, especially for the table where that investor's son from Chicago will be. From what Roger mentioned, he has more severe tactile and auditory hypersensitivity." Luciana, who had gone from skeptic to reluctant collaborator in recent weeks, approached with a to-do list. The noise-cancelling headphones arrived, but we only got 10 units instead of the 15 requested. The supplier said the rest will only arrive next week. "We can prioritize them for the children and teenagers," Deborah suggested, "and have some available to rotate among the adults who might need them." Maurice, who was overseeing the preparations, with growing nervousness, cleared his throat to get the team's attention. "This event is our big showcase," he reminded them. "If it goes well, we'll open up an entirely new market. If we fail—" "We won't fail," Deborah stated with a confidence that surprised herself. "We're prepared." The chef nodded, not entirely convinced, but willing to trust the team he had assembled. In the last few weeks, all employees had received at least basic training on neurodiversity and sensory adaptations. Some, like Paul and Amanda, had delved deeper into the topic out of personal interest. "Has the magazine confirmed their attendance?" Helena asked. "Yes," Maurice replied. "Renee Michaels is coming with a photographer. The article is scheduled for next month's issue, with a possible follow-up in a special feature on inclusive gastronomy at the end of the year." The feature would be the crowning achievement of a project that had started improvisationally and was now transforming into an innovative business model. Deborah was still amazed at the speed of the changes. In less than 2 months, the Parkside table had gone from a traditional fine dining restaurant to a pioneer in sensory inclusion, while keeping its reputation for excellence intact. "Oh, I almost forgot," Luciana said, returning with an envelope. "This arrived for you." Deborah opened the envelope and found an invitation printed on high-quality paper. "The American Gastronomy Institute is pleased to invite Deborah Evans to the National Conference on Culinary Innovation, where she will present the case study, Sensory Inclusion in High Gastronomy, the Parkside Table Experience." "Oh my God," she murmured, feeling her legs go weak. "This is the biggest event in the industry in the country." Helena smiled, not at all surprised. "It was a matter of time. What you all are doing here is revolutionary. And I'm not saying that as a consultant, but as someone who has worked in inclusion for 15 years and has never seen such a rapid and effective implementation." Deborah put the invitation in her bag, trying to process what this meant for her still fledgling career in gastronomy. From a student working to pay for college to a speaker at a national conference, all in a matter of weeks. The 3 days leading up to the event passed in a blur of preparations, rehearsals, and last-minute adjustments. The entire team worked in sync, even those who had initially resisted the idea. Even Frederick, the once skeptical pastry chef, had developed a special dessert menu with different textures and sensory intensities, each identified with discrete symbols. On the night of the event, Deborah arrived 2 hours early, wearing the new uniform Morris had commissioned for her. No longer the traditional black and white of the waitstaff, but an elegant navy blue suit with a small gold pin identifying her as the coordinator of inclusive experiences, a title that still made her smile in surprise when she heard it. "How are we looking?" she asked Paul, who was supervising the final table arrangements. "Everything's according to plan. The sensory kits are distributed, the zones are marked, the team is ready. Roger has called me twice already to confirm details, but I think it's just a father's anxiety." Deborah nodded, understanding that anxiety perfectly. For families like Roger's, every outing was a risky bet, an unknown territory full of potential triggers for meltdowns. The trust he placed in the parkside table was both a privilege and a responsibility. At 7 p.m., the first guests began to arrive. Roger led the way with Matthew holding his hand. The boy seemed more confident, though still cautious, exploring the now familiar environment with observant eyes. Close behind were Rachel, Roger's sister, and her husband Edward, a tall man with a warm laugh that immediately made Deborah like him. "Deborah!" Roger exclaimed, approaching for a restrained hug. He had learned that she, like many neurodivergent people, preferred more discreet physical contact. "Everything looks incredible. I can't wait to introduce you to our international guests." "Hi, Deborah," Matthew greeted, glancing up briefly. "I brought my new paleontology book to show you later." "I can't wait to see it," she replied, genuinely interested. In recent weeks, she had developed a special affection for Matthew, whose intelligence and sensitivity were increasingly revealed in a welcoming environment. Gradually, the dining room filled up. Executives in elegant suits, some accompanied by their families, mingled while waiters offered canapes and champagne. In a quieter corner, Deborah recognized Dr. Porter and his wife Beatrice, chatting animatedly with a couple she identified as the parents of Julia, Matthew's school friend. Renee Michaels, the magazine editor, arrived with a discreet photographer who captured the atmosphere without disruptive flashes, a requirement Deborah had insisted upon. Everything was going according to plan until a loud group of American investors entered, talking and laughing at a volume that immediately tensed the room. Deborah watched as Matthew and 2 other neurodivergent children reacted, stiffened shoulders, hands over their ears, wide eyes. Before the situation could escalate, Paul intervened with elegance, guiding the group to a more secluded area, discreetly explaining that there were designated zones for different levels of socialization. Confused at first, the Americans soon understood when they noticed the subtle signage and embraced the concept with curiosity. "Brilliant setup you have here," one of them commented, apparently impressed with the innovation. "Very thoughtful design." While that crisis was averted, Deborah noticed that the son of the Chicago investor, a 15-year-old named Philip, seemed particularly uncomfortable. He was leaning against a wall, breathing heavily, his hands moving repetitively. Approaching calmly, Deborah offered him noise-cancelling headphones and suggested a short walk in the outdoor garden, where she had created a small decompression station with comfortable seating and positive sensory stimuli. The teenager's father, Marcus Boone, a businessman known for his toughness in negotiations, watched the interaction with an expression that mixed surprise and restrained emotion. When Philip agreed to follow Deborah to the garden, Marcus approached Roger. "In 15 years of taking Philip to restaurants, I've never seen anyone approach him like that," he commented in a low voice. "Usually the staff talks to me about him, as if he's invisible or unable to understand." Roger smiled, understanding that experience exactly. "That's how it all started," he explained. Deborah was the first person who spoke directly to Matthew, who saw past the difficult behavior and recognized the person behind it. In the garden, Philip had already calmed down. Seated in a comfortable armchair, he was manipulating a small water feature with colored lights that Deborah had installed especially for the event, His face, once tense, now showed fascination. "I like how the light changes when the water moves," he commented, surprising Deborah with his articulation. "It's mathematical, predictable, but also variable." "Exactly," she agreed, sitting at a respectful distance. "It combines order and surprise like a good recipe." The teenager looked at her with renewed interest. "Do you see patterns in things too?" "Always," Deborah admitted. "In the kitchen, in the ingredients, in the chemical reactions. It's like a dance of molecules that we can predict, but that always holds little surprises." They talked for a few minutes about patterns, mathematics, molecular gastronomy, and other topics that clearly fascinated Philip. When they finally returned to the dining room, Marcus was watching from a distance with an expression Deborah couldn't quite decipher. Dinner was served at a carefully planned pace, with sufficient intervals between courses to avoid sensory overload. Each dish came with a detailed description not only of the ingredients but also of the textures and intensities, allowing everyone to make informed choices. In the center of the room, Maurice proudly presented his main creation, a dish he called Sensory Harmony, a composition that offered 5 different gustatory and tactile experiences, which could be combined or tried separately, accommodating different sensory preferences without compromising culinary sophistication. "This is the future of gastronomy," he declared, with a genuine enthusiasm that contrasted with his usual reserve. "Not just inclusive, but personalized, respecting human neurodiversity as part of the rich tapestry of experiences that makes our art meaningful." Renee Michaels was taking notes furiously, clearly impressed by the transformation of the traditionalist chef into a passionate advocate for inclusive gastronomy. When dessert was served, Frederick's special creation, which included different temperatures, textures, and sweetness intensities in a single concept, Roger stood up to make a brief speech. "When I planned this event, I envisioned a business evening where for once I could include my son without embarrassment," he began. "What I didn't expect was for this experience to become something much larger, a demonstration of how genuine inclusion not only allows people like Matthew to participate in the world, but enriches the experience for all of us." Gazes turned to the boy, who for the first time at an event of this scale was relaxed enough to fully enjoy the experience, talking animatedly with Julia and Philip about dinosaurs and mathematical patterns in nature. "What Deborah and the team at the Parkside table have created here is not just an adapted restaurant," Roger continued. "It's a model for how our spaces, all of them from offices to schools, from malls to theaters, can be reinvented to welcome human diversity in its fullness." The applause was restrained, respecting the auditory sensitivities present, but no less enthusiastic for it. Roger raised his glass in a silent toast toward Deborah, who felt her eyes well up. Maurice approached, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You transformed my restaurant, Evans," he said in a low voice, "and more importantly, you transformed my vision of what gastronomy can and should be." At the end of the night, as the last guests were saying their goodbyes, Marcus Boone, the investor from Chicago, approached Deborah with a solemn expression. "My son spent the entire evening at a social event without a single meltdown," he said, his voice slightly choked. "That has never happened before." "Never?" Deborah smiled, understanding the weight of that statement. "I'm glad it worked out for him. Philip is a brilliant young man." "He is," Marcus agreed, "and I want more people to have the chance to discover that. I want to finance the expansion of this concept." Deborah blinked, confused. "Expansion?" "Inclusive restaurants in Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, a chain that sets a new standard for American gastronomy," he explained, "with you and Maurice at the helm, if you accept the challenge." Before she could answer, Deborah felt a small hand take hers. It was Matthew, his eyes shining with excitement. "Deborah, Philip showed me how to make fractal equations with origami. Can I show you tomorrow?" "Of course you can," she replied, smiling at the boy who, without knowing it, had sparked a revolution. Marcus watched the interaction with an understanding smile. "Think about my offer. But don't. Answer now. Tonight is for celebrating what you've already achieved." As the businessman walked away, Deborah stood motionless, trying to process the magnitude of what she had just heard. From a waitress improvising solutions for a child in crisis to the potential director of a national chain of inclusive restaurants, life had come full circle in just 2 months. Maurice approached again, now accompanied by Renee from the magazine, and Helena, the consultant. "I think we need to talk about the future, Evans," the chef said with a glint in his eye she had never seen before. "A future much bigger than we ever imagined." At that moment, looking out over the dining room that had been the stage for so many transformations, Deborah knew her life would never be the same. What had begun as a gesture of empathy was now unfolding into possibilities she could barely comprehend. And all because on an ordinary night, she had decided to see beyond appearances and recognize the humanity behind a crisis. 2 years had passed since that transformative night at the Parkside table. The Chicago sky displayed a gradient of orange and purple as Deborah finalized the last adjustments to the new sensory menu at Embrace Lincoln Park, the 3rd restaurant in the Embrace network, set to open the following week. At 34, Deborah Evans was no longer just a culinary student working as a waitress. Now, as the director of sensory experience and a minority partner in the Embrace network, she coordinated a team of consultants, nutritionists, chefs, and occupational therapists who were transforming American gastronomy one meal at a time. Her phone vibrated with a notification. It was Roger, sending photos from Matthew's 9th birthday party, celebrated at Embrace Upper West, as the original restaurant had been renamed. In the pictures, the boy was smiling broadly, surrounded by friends in front of a paleontology-themed cake, created especially by Frederick, who now led the entire pastry division for the network. "Matthew said to thank you for the perfect party, and he asks when you're coming to New York to show him your fossil collection," the message read. Deborah smiled, remembering the small box of fossils she had started collecting after Matthew sparked her interest in paleontology. It was one of the many ways that unexpected encounter had changed her life in aspects that went far beyond the professional. Putting her phone away, Deborah surveyed the still-empty dining room of the new restaurant. Unlike the original, which had to be adapted, Embrace Lincoln Park had been designed from the ground up to be sensorily accessible. The architecture considered distinct acoustic zones, adjustable lighting, controlled ventilation, and decompression spaces integrated into the elegant design. Everything looked natural, sophisticated. Accessibility was not an add-on, but an intrinsic part of the place's identity. "It turned out beautifully," commented Helena, who was now the director of accessibility for the network and one of the key figures in team training. "Each restaurant is better than the last." "We've learned a lot in these 2 years," Deborah agreed. "I still remember when we were improvising with homemade modeling clay and headphones back at the original place." The two laughed, recalling the early days when everything was experimental and intuitive. Now, the Embrace Network had established protocols, ongoing research, and partnerships with universities and institutes specializing in neurodiversity. "Speaking of learning," Helena said, handing a magazine to Deborah. "The Cuisine and Art special on the network's 2-year anniversary is out. Renee did an incredible job." On the cover was an elegant photo of Embrace South Beach, the network's 2nd restaurant, opened the previous year. The headline proclaimed, "Sensory Revolution, How a Crisis Transformed American Gastronomy." The article traced the journey from the incident with Matthew to the restaurant chain that now employed over 150 people, including a vocational training program for neurodivergent youth that had become a benchmark in the country. Deborah felt a deep sense of pride as she read testimonials from families who could now enjoy high-quality dining experiences without the weight of judgment or exclusion. "It's amazing how far we've come," she commented, running her fingers over a page showing a photo of her with Morris and Marcus, Boone at the opening of Embrace South Beach. "And this is just the beginning," Helena replied. "International interest is only growing. I've received 3 invitations to speak at conferences abroad this month alone." Deborah's phone rang again. It was Paul, the former maitre d' who now managed Embrace Upper West. "Guess who's here?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "Luciana. She came with her niece, who is apparently on the spectrum. She seems different. Softer, you know. She asked me to send her regards." Deborah smiled, remembering how the former administrative manager had been one of the most critical voices at the beginning of the project. Seeing Luciana now embracing the concept with her own family was further proof of how understanding could transform perspectives. "Tell her I'll be in New York soon to visit, and that I'm happy she stopped by." After hanging up, Deborah continued her walk through the restaurant, checking the final details before the grand opening. In the kitchen, the team was working on the final menu tests, which now included dishes with detailed sensory descriptions and options for different profiles, without ever compromising on quality or presentation. Carla, the new chef recently hired from a Michelin-starred restaurant in Paris, was enthusiastic about the concept. "In France, we are just beginning to discuss sensory inclusion," she commented as she finished a dish. "You all are years ahead. That's why I wanted to come work here." "We were forced to innovate out of necessity," Deborah explained. "Sometimes the best ideas are born from unexpected challenges." As evening fell, when the final preparations were complete, Deborah received a surprise visit. Roger and Matthew had traveled to Chicago specifically to see the new restaurant before the opening. "We couldn't miss it," Roger explained, embracing her warmly. It all started with us. Matthew, now taller and more confident, but with the same observant and intelligent gaze, explored the space with curiosity. "I like the color-coded zones," he commented, referring to the discrete system that indicated different levels of sensory stimulation in each area. "It's logical and beautiful at the same time." "It was inspired by that fractal mathematics book you showed me last year," Deborah replied, observing with satisfaction how the boy had grown not only physically, but in his ability to interact with the world. While Matthew explored the kitchen, guided by Carla, Roger, and Deborah sat at a table near the window, contemplating the Chicago skyline as it began to light up. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been working that night," Roger reflected. "If it had been any other waiter, they probably would have asked you to leave," Deborah completed, acknowledging the still common reality in many establishments. "And we never would have known what we were capable of together." Roger nodded thoughtfully. "You know what impresses me the most? It's not just neurodivergent children who benefit, it's everyone. I've heard so many customers comment on how they prefer the experience at Embrace restaurants, the tranquility, the ability to choose the level of stimulation, the clarity of the information." "Universal design," Deborah commented, repeating the concept Helena so often emphasized. "When you design for the margins, you improve the experience for everyone in the middle." Deborah's phone rang again. It was Maurice, letting her know he was running late for the pre-opening dinner because his meeting with international investors had run long. The Embrace network was now attracting interest from hotel groups and premium restaurants around the world, eager to implement the pioneering model developed in the US. When she hung up, Deborah found Matthew standing in front of her, holding a small object. "I made this for you," he said, holding out a complex origami butterfly. "It's made of a special paper that changes color with temperature. I thought it matched what you do, transform things." Moved, Deborah accepted the gift, recognizing the depth of the gesture. That butterfly perfectly represented their journey, the transformation, the unexpected beauty that emerges from processes of change. At 7 p.m., the restaurant began to welcome special guests for the pre-opening dinner. They were journalists, influencers, partners, and most importantly, families who had been instrumental in shaping the Embrace concept over the past 2 years. Among them, Deborah recognized Julia, Matthew's school friend, now a confident pre-teen, who immediately pulled her friend aside to show him her new portable telescope. Philip, the teenage son of investor Marcus Boone, now 17, was chatting animatedly with a group of young people at one of the tables, all participants in the network's vocational training program. Dr. Porter and Beatrice arrived shortly after, now regular consultants for the educational program the Embrace Foundation had established to disseminate knowledge about sensory inclusion among gastronomy and hospitality professionals. "So proud of you," Beatrice said, hugging Deborah. "You're making history." When everyone was seated, Maurice finally arrived, accompanied by Marcus Boone and 2 Japanese businessmen. The chef, once so traditional and resistant to change, was now an enthusiast of inclusive innovation, giving talks around the world on how sensory accessibility had not only humanized his cuisine, but also made it more creative and relevant. "We have an announcement to make," he declared, once everyone had been served the first course. "The Embrace Network has just finalized a partnership with the Sensory Experience Group from Tokyo. We are taking our model to Asia, starting with Japan and Singapore." Discreet applause, as was the tradition in Embrace spaces, rippled through the room. Deborah felt a wave of dizziness, thinking about the scale the project was taking on. From a small gesture of empathy in a New York restaurant to an international chain of establishments transforming global gastronomy. "But tonight is not about expansion or business," Maurice continued, his gaze meeting Deborah's. "It's about celebrating the human connections that made all of this possible. It's about recognizing that, behind every behavior we don't initially understand, there is a person seeking to be seen, heard, and welcomed in their entirety." As the dinner proceeded, Deborah watched the room filled with diverse people sharing a high-quality dining experience, each in their own way. Some wore noise-canceling headphones, others preferred specific textures, some periodically retreated to the decompression spaces, and it all happened naturally, without judgment, without awkwardness. Later, when dessert was served, a special creation inspired by Matthew's origami butterfly, with elements that changed color and texture throughout the tasting, Roger rose again for a toast. "2 years ago, I walked into a restaurant believing it would be another night of embarrassment and isolation," he began. "I left with renewed hope. Today, I see my son and dozens of other neurodivergent children and adults occupying spaces that were once denied to them. And I see a world that is slowly beginning to understand that true sophistication lies not in exclusivity, but in the ability to include with elegance and respect." Deborah's eyes welled up as she felt the weight of those words. She remembered the insecure young woman who had improvised solutions that night, never imagining the waves that small gesture would set in motion. How could she have known that a cold compress and a fidget spinner would result in a quiet revolution in American gastronomy? After dinner, while the guests socialized, Matthew approached Deborah, who was watching the city from the window. "I'm writing a book," he announced, with the direct objectivity that characterized him. "About how small changes can have big impacts, like the flapping of a butterfly's wings." "The butterfly effect?" Deborah commented, smiling at the symbol that now seemed even more significant. "Yes," Matthew agreed. "I wanted to interview you, to understand what it was like on that first night to make the decision to help." Deborah reflected for a moment. "It wasn't a big decision, Matthew. It was just humanity. Seeing beyond the behavior and recognizing the person, something we should all do naturally. But not everyone does," he observed with the simple, direct wisdom that often surprised the adults around him. "And that's why we need to tell this story, so more people will understand." At that moment, watching the boy who had inadvertently started it all, Deborah understood that her work was just beginning. The restaurants were just the start. The real revolution would be cultural, transforming the way society viewed and welcomed human diversity in all its manifestations. As the night drew to a close and the guests said their goodbyes, Deborah contemplated the origami butterfly in her hands, now gently changing to shades of blue as the room's temperature dropped. Like that delicate and complex creation, the journey they had all traveled was the result of countless small folds and transformations, some planned, others unexpected, all necessary. And just as the butterfly emerges from the chrysalis completely transformed, yet carrying in its DNA the essence of who it has always been, the world of American gastronomy was now reinventing itself, embracing inclusion not as an appendix, but as a fundamental part of its identity. On the Chicago horizon, the city lights created artificial constellations that rivaled the starry sky. For Deborah, each of those lights represented possibilities, new restaurants, new spaces, new minds opening up to a concept of acceptance that transcended gastronomy and touched the very core of what it meant to build a community. And it was all because, on one seemingly ordinary night, someone had decided to look beyond the obvious and see the silent plea for understanding hidden behind a scream. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the journey of Deborah, Matthew, and all the characters who transformed the Parkside Table has touched your hearts. This story reminds us that small gestures of understanding can trigger profound transformations, not only in the lives of those who receive the gesture, but in an entire society. To continue experiencing emotions like this, we have a special playlist with other inspiring stories about inclusion and empathy. Find it by clicking the link beside this. If this narrative about how small acts can create big changes touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and celebrate human diversity in all its forms. Share your own experiences in the comments about moments when a small gesture of understanding transformed a difficult situation. Together, we can inspire more acts of acceptance in our daily lives